The main problem when you're connecting a bunch of pedals together is that you have to reconnect them every time you want to change the signal flow, and that gets boring pretty fast. So my solution, well, was to build this pedal board. If you don't know, a pedal board is just a piece of wood, metal or plastic where you attach your pedals. But mine comes with a twist, and it solves the problem of having to physically reconnect your pedals every time you want to change the signal flow, because I use a Patchbay. In today's video, we're going to go over everything you need to know to put together a flexible pedal board for synths, studio use, and heck, even guitars if you're one of those people. And we're going to talk about what gear you need, how to connect everything, how inserts, aux, and returns work on a mixer, and what a Patchbay is, and how normaling works on a Patchbay, because that's something that seems to confuse a lot of people. So we're going to go over all of that. So here's the current state of this slightly absurd pedal board. I have a reverb, a chorus, I have a compressor, distortion, there's a lo-fi effect, we have the microcosm, which I don't think needs more of an introduction. This has been all over YouTube. And then we have a reverb from Chase Bliss with motorized faders, a send delay, and a stereo filter. And then we have the most important piece here, and that's the Patchbay. We also have this mini Patchbay over here because I ran out of patch point on the mini bay, and here we have the Soya connected in and out stereo. So let me patch something up here just to give you an idea of what we can do. So we have this synth going here. Now it's just going into the pedal board and out again, not through any effects. But if we want to, we can just patch in, for example, the CXM reverb like so. Or we could just patch it into the send delay, and that's just beautiful. But the real magic starts to happen when we combine effects. So we have the dry sound. Can drive the signal, introduce the delay, and then add in the reverb. So the beauty of this pedal board is that I don't have to reconnect anything on the actual pedal board because it's running into this Patchbay here and basically turns my pedals into sort of a modular system. And here I'm running a beat through the effect setup. So we have a compressor, we have some distortion, and we have this lo-fi effect over here. These two are mono. So what I'm doing is I'm going mono here from aux 1 into the first one here, and then out into the second one, and then I'm actually fake stereoing it into the generation loss. So we can add some compression. Some lo-fi effect. And some drive, and it will be a little crazy, I think. And why not run all of this into the send delay? And another benefit of doing it like this is that it's very easy to interchange pedals, because all you have to do is just remove it, remove the power and the input and output connections, and then put something else there in its place. And the flexibility of the system is literally tied to the Patchbay, and if you want to pick one up, I've partnered with a new synthesizer focused store that does things a little bit different. The store with the fitting name Synths is based in Sweden but ships to the entire EU and US, and they're specializing on gear that you won't find in big stores. Synthesizers, pedals and other audio gear from smaller indie manufacturers like the Swenergizer or the Metal Fetishes and the DF Audio Mini Bay. They also have a lot of pedals in stock from Dreadbox. And if you're making something unique and cool, please reach out to Synths. I know that they're actively looking for cool and interesting stuff. So go and check out Synths, they're linked in the description, and by supporting them, you're also supporting smaller manufacturers. Now, one of the first things I want to recommend is having a good power supply. This one is from Chiox, but I'm not sponsored by them. There are plenty of options out there. And the whole idea is that you have one power supply that powers multiple pedals at once. And it also helped me a lot with getting rid of ground noise. I'm not entirely sure why, but there's some magic going on there. And when looking for a power supply, I would definitely get one where you can set different voltages like you can on the Chiox. Make sure you read the power requirements for the pedals before you connect them to your power supply. I don't want you to destroy any of your pedals. And then I have this monstrosity here, which is the Mini Bay that I'm gonna use to connect all of the pedals. And this Patchbay is made by DF Audio, but there's also this other Patchbay that I found that could also be interesting to use for a pedal board. And when we're talking about gear, I want to make something perfectly clear. You don't need to buy expensive pedals. There are plenty on the used market because guitarists get bored too and sell off their pedals. It's a huge market. And there's also a lot of affordable pedals like the Zoom CDR, for example. And my buddy Jorb suggested that I use these cables here, and they are TRS to dual TS. What they let you do is use one socket here on the Mini Bay for 2 signals. So you plug it in here. So now I either have stereo input or output depending on what we connect here, or we could use it for, I think that the habit here is, I think there's no way of using it stereo, so that would make this an ideal situation where I have 2 cables. So one going into it and one going out of it back. So in and out on the Patchbay. Oh, and something you really need to have on your pedal board is Velcro. That's mandatory. And on the Patchbay, I also have to leave space for inputs and outputs of, for example, my audio interface, or in this case, I'm thinking of using this with the fine gear mixer. So I'm probably going to use all of the B connections here for the sense from the mixer. So that's where I'm tapping the audio. The audio is coming from the mixer here, and I can connect it to whatever effects I want, and then back into the stereo returns that go to the mixer. Now, something that might be a bit confusing is that the Mini Bay has these labels, effects and A and B. These are just connections, and any connection can be an input or an output, it can be a synth, it can be effects, it can be anything. The only thing you need to keep in mind is that there's a convention where you have outputs from instruments, for example, on the top row, namely the A row, and inputs to mixers and audio interfaces, for example, on the B row. But because I'm a guy who always has to be a little bit of a contrarian, I'm of course doing things very differently. And I bought a bunch of these. These are Swedish-made pedal cables so that you can have pedals sitting very closely to each other without the cables getting in the way. I also recommend getting some sort of label maker because that's good for studio use in general, but also to label the patch points so you know what's connected where. Ah, beautiful. So elegant. I also make sure to clearly label the cables that are going to my mixer or audio interface. Now, why are we using these cables here, these adapters? Now, the reason why we're using adapters is they are first and foremost quite cheap, and you already probably have a ton of cables laying around at home, normal cables, TS cables like this, for example. And since this is a flat one, it will mean that the end going into the effect won't take up as much space. Now, for this build, I also used these cables here, which are TRS to TRS, so basically stereo to stereo if I want to, because these pedals have stereo inputs and outputs. I'm going to use them for that. So we're running a stereo cable from here, that's A1 and A2, into here, into the mood, and then back again. So now let's connect this reverb here. So we're going left input, right input, And then we figure out where we want the pedal on the actual Patchbay. And let's make a label. So now we have the Black Hole and Tricera chorus. They have stereo inputs on TRS and dual TS outputs. So we're gonna go for the outputs first, left and right. And then we're bringing out more of the stereo cables. So we'll go 5 and 6 into the Black Hole, and then we'll go 9 and 10 into the Tricera chorus. Now here's an important lesson. If you do not label things, it will make everything so much harder. And I should say that I turned all normalization of this Patchbay off. Bo, it's called normaled. So what does normalization mean?
Bo explains!
Normaling refers to how the signal flows through the Patchbay, and there are 3 main ways it can flow. First, we connect an instrument output on the back of the Patchbay to the top row. Remember, any gear connections goes on the back and the patching is done on the front. It's the same principle on the mini bay, but instead it's gear connections on the back and patching goes on the top. Then we connect mixer or audio interface inputs to the bottom row on the back. The idea is that we have sources, something sending something on the top row, and the destinations to where the audio can be sent on the bottom row. And a way to remember how the signal actually flows is to think that the sound flows downwards. It goes into the Patchbay at the top on the back, then flows down out through the bottom back connections. And this brings us neatly to the concept of normaling, which refers to how the connections between outputs and inputs are internally wired within the Patchbay. There are 3 options for normaling. The first option is no normaling, which means that the signal just goes from the socket on the back to the corresponding socket on the front and stops there. So if you want the signal to actually go somewhere, you have to use a patch cable, and this is how I use the mini bay because I'm not a big fan of normaling. I want to control the signal flow all the time. I don't want the sound to go anywhere unless I patch it, so I use no normaling.
When I work with hardware, I want to know that the only thing that is being connected is the stuff that I am connecting. Nothing else happens. No signal is being sent anywhere except to where I tell it to go.
Now, if your Patchbay is normaled or has a switch that can turn on normaling, the upper and lower pair of sockets are internally linked. In practice, this means that if we plug an instrument output into the top socket and a mixer input into the socket directly below, the signal will flow from the instrument down into the mixer. So if our Patchbay is normaled and the signal is flowing automatically from the top to the bottom, what then happens if we plug a patch cable into one of the corresponding sockets on the front? Well, here we have 2 different ways to go, or 2 different settings. There's something called full normaling, and it means that the connection between the upper and lower sockets on the back is broken when we plug a patch cable into either the upper or lower socket on the front. So by plugging a patch cable into the top, we're breaking the connection between top and bottom. We can then send that audio into an effect and then back into the bottom socket, which goes to the mixer, so we're re-establishing the connection that way. And the other option or setting is half normaled, and it means that the rear connections are linked, but if you insert something into the upper socket on the front, the connection is not broken. This lets you, for example, take a synth signal from the top row and you can send it out to an effect, but the dry signal is still going, it's still being routed, it's flowing down out through the bottom because the signal is not being broken. You can then take that little patch cable that you patched and patch it into an effect and back into another mixer input, for example. So you now have a totally dry signal and an effects signal, for example. With half normaled, if you insert something into the lower socket on the front, the connection between the upper and lower pair is broken. And this is one reason why we put sources on the top and destinations on the bottom, because we might want to be able to tap the source signal, like a synth, for example, running through effect and then back into a mixer, for example. The way I use my pedal board is with my dawless synth setup. I'm sending audio through a mixer using aux sends into the pedal board and then returning them back into the mixer. More about that later. thing that I want to improve in the future is having more aux sends on my mixer. I only have 2, meaning I can only send stereo to the pedal board, and I want to improve that with a bigger mixer. But what are these aux and these sends that I'm talking about?
Bo explains!
So what's an aux and what's a return? Well, let me explain. Most mixers have one or more aux outputs. Aux stands for auxiliary, meaning it's outside of the mixer or system itself. It lets you tap the signal, send it from a channel out through normally a mono output that is separate from the main mix. So this signal can then be routed through the effects, and the wet signal that is coming back from the effects can be sent back into the mixer again by connecting the output of the effects into a channel on the mixer. Some mixers have dedicated return channels. Return channels can be used for synths or other instruments too, it's not just for effects. My Soundcraft mixer, for example, has 2 aux sends, meaning 2 mono channels going out of the mixer, but there is no dedicated return channels. Instead, it has 2 stereo channels that I can use for effect returns. And if we look at the mixer, there's the aux level knob. You use this to set how much of the wet signal that you want to blend with the dry signal that is already passing through the mixer. And there's many ways you can use aux that isn't related to effects. For example, you can connect a sampler to the aux outputs and then use the aux level knob to send audio to the sampler, so you can decide which channels to sample into the sampler and how much. So now on the back of the mixer, we're going to connect the stereo returns and the aux sends. So we have 4 connections here that are going into the 4 aux inputs there. And then we have the stereo returns that are going in here. If everything's connected together as it should be, we can take aux1 into CXM input here, take aux2, that way we actually get a stereo signal if we want to out of the mixer, and then we can take CXM out into R1 here, and so. Now, if I now turn up the send, we should get some effect. And we do. Nice. You can listen to just effect. Lovely. Now, if the aux output is mono, how do I send a stereo signal to a stereo effect? Firstly, you don't necessarily need the aux send to be stereo to get a stereo effects return. You can feed most stereo pedals with a mono signal and it will still give you a stereo effect in return. But if you're chaining multiple effects that are stereo, it can be a good idea to go stereo out of the mixer. Why? Well, that's a very complicated story and it will have you question life itself. In short, it has to do with how the true stereo image is retained in a pedal and between pedals. Let's not think too much about it, it's a whole thing. So if you have a mixer with 2 aux output, just connect aux1 to the left input of your effect, then connect aux2 to the right input of your effect. Then you connect your stereo synth or other stereo source into the mixer, and then you locate what's called the channel panning, and you pan the left output from the synth to the left on the mixer and the right output from the synth to the right on the mixer, so that we actually get a stereo sound. And then you take the left and right outputs of your effect and you feed it back into the mixer. You either use the return inputs, a stereo channel, or 2 mono channels, and make sure to pan them left and right, otherwise they're still in mono. You then turn up aux1 on the left channel and aux2 on the right channel. Remember, we are feeding aux1 into the left input on the effect and then aux2 into the right input. So you just turn up the corresponding knobs on the mixer. In your mixer, you might find another little connection here called insert, and that's another jack typically found on mixers, but also on some audio interfaces like the Audio Fuse, for example. Insert refers to insert effect, which is different from a send effect. An insert effect is often mono and per channel, like a compressor or noise gate or EQ, and they're inserted early into the signal path. And why is it per track? Well, traditionally you don't want to have the same compressor on every single instrument, for example, because the dynamics are different per instrument. Whereas a send effect, like a reverb or a delay, is something that can be used across channels, shared. To use the insert jack, you need a special cable. It's a TRS stereo cable in one end that splits into two mono cables in the other end. You connect the stereo end of the cable into the insert jack, and then you take the cable labeled tip, which is often the left cable, into the effect, and then you take the ring, which is often the red cable, out of the effect. Now the signal flows from the input of the mixer through the effects and then back into the mixer, but pre any EQ on the mixer, for example, and pre the aux send. So anything you have affecting the signal with the insert effect is then being fed into the aux effect, for example. Do note that you can use other kinds of effects like a chorus, for example, on an insert as well. It doesn't have to be a send effect, and you can even use a reverb and delay as an insert, but it's just not a very common way to do it. And just a few words of warning here. Firstly, make sure that all your audio cables actually work. I realized when I hooked everything up that one cable wasn't working. And secondly, label your cables. I didn't label them left and right, which caused me a lot of headache. So label them at both ends if you want it to be a super smooth experience. If you want a bit of frustration in your life, don't label them like I did. So I hope you learned something about pedal boards. For me, it's been a journey learning about normaling, about mixers, aux and sends and returns and everything. And I hope I conveyed some of that knowledge to you all. Go and check out today's sponsor, Synths, linked below. That's where you can find the mini bay as well as other cool things. And as always, have a great day. Talk to you later.